So we're on chapter 18, going on through section 3, and we're going over the times of the first president. So we went over the President Grant's administration onto President Rutherford B. Hayes. Grant was the 18th president. He was the 19th president. And now we're going to go on the presidency of James A. Garfield in 1881. He was the 20th president. Garfield was a very flamboyant man. He was very, very Christian. He was born again. You know, he believed he fought against slavery. He was an abolitionist. He was a reformer in many ways. He was came in as a dark horse candidate, as no one really knew him at first, but he was well known in Ohio as governor in Ohio. He also was in the political realm, and also he too was a general in the Civil War. Very popular in these areas, but not really known that he would even run for president. So let's go on our notes here. It says, James Garfield believed that government should focus on agricultural interest and manufacturing as new wealth. So he was very focused on the economy, as you can see there. He believed enterprises were of importance to our moral and material well-being. So he supported business, he supported agriculture. He wanted to help advance the U.S. economy for prosperity. And he was very outgoing with his policy in very detail and what he planned to do. So he was so excited as becoming president. But what happened to Garfield? He was assassinated a few months into his presidency. It's kind of weird that we don't really know much about this, because it's a very important thing in history for another president to be assassinated. I mean, pretty close in time to President Lincoln, right? He was going for this relaxing weekend and stopped at a train station. His wife was recovering from malaria, and so he got out, basically going to meet and relax as his presidency went through. He was excited, I'm sure. And at the station, at that time, they really didn't have bodyguards or protection like they do now. And so he was shot at the station. Charles Guiteau was the name of the guy who shot him twice. And 79 days later, he died of complications of a wound infection. Basically, the bullet, one was in his arm and one lodged next to his ribs. But in these days, the bullet would not even have killed him. He actually could have probably recovered, and we have other presidents that have got shot, like especially Andrew Jackson, who had a bullet and lived with it for the rest of his life. So that could have happened, but at that time, his doctor, he had a doctor, but another doctor decided to take over, which was kind of weird. And basically back then, they just dug with their, used their dirty, grubby hands. They didn't even wash their hands in the midst, and he got infection because they kept, digging around trying to find that bullet. And 79 days later, after he would die of complications of the wound infection, that's how he died. He went from he weighed like 210 pounds, he was a tall man, 210 pounds, good looking young man. He wasn't even 50 yet. And he went from that, weighing that much down to 135 pounds. So I'm sure he suffered much. So Charles Guiteau, his killer, had long been stalking him and believed that God wanted him to kill him. And he also was involved, Guiteau was involved in a lot of weird things, in a free love commune and all these things. Charles Guiteau was very crazy. Talk about double mind. He was very crazy. He thought he was disgruntled politically. He wanted James Garfield to make him to be able to be representative to Paris, or to give him a certain job, and of course Garfield didn't, and so he was disgruntled, and that's one of the reasons he said he wanted to kill James Garfield. But then he also said that he represents the stalwarts. Okay, what is that? Well, the stalwarts were divided. The stalwarts and the moderates, I should say, half-breeds, or called them moderates, were divided. The stalwarts wanted everything to stay I always say everything to stay just status quo. And then this is the Republican Party. So it was divided into the stalwarts, and then James Garfield was again very progressive. So that he was basically called a moderate. And so they divided that. His vice president, Chet Arthur, was a stalwart. And so Guiteau said he was a stalwart, and so he was against James Garfield being that moderate progressive minded. And so that was one of the reasons that he killed him. But when you look back at Guiteau, his father thought he was possessed by the devil. He tried to attack his sister with an axe. I mean, he was just basically a crazy guy. Now, if somebody sent him to kill, we still think there may be a conspiracy there, but none is really known for sure. So Garfield's funeral procession, the president's funeral procession, was very grand, and people lined up and they mourned for Garfield. Basically, even while he was suffering, people came, prayed with him. People were supporting him, and they loved him even more during this time as President Garfield. And when he died, the country mourned bitterly for this president. A little bit more about Garfield's life here. I like this trivia right here. It says that Garfield, his height was 6 feet. He was tall. He was raised on a poor farm. He was actually one of the poorest, had the history of one of the poorest presidents coming in, because basically, his father had died and his mother had raised him. So he was raised very much in poverty. He was a Civil War hero, and James Garfield was the poorest man ever to have become president. I said that already. He was the first left-handed president. That's pretty interesting. More about his life here. He was born in Ohio in a log cabin, raised by his mother as his father had died. He loved adventure books and he loved baseball. He wanted to be a sailor, but instead he towed barges up the Ohio River. So he had this job was a very menial job. He was a very strong student and a skillful public speaker later on, and he came through as he went through school. He always prospered in school. He even taught Greek and Latin, and he became a Bible scholar. In fact, he was ordained as a minister for the disciples of Christ, and then on the side he studied law, and he studied law independently, preparing for law as going into the political realm. So in 1858, he married Lucretia Rudolph. She was his classmate and also his student later on, and they ended up having 7 children. A very self-made man. He excelled in everything. He was school president. He was positive. He was kind. He fought as a major general in the Civil War, 42nd Ohio Infantry. He was a great hero. He represented his home state as a Republican of Ohio. He was basically stood for the Ohio legislator, in the House of Representatives. He was a free soiler, which meant that he was against slavery. A dark horse candidate was that they didn't expect him to even run for president, especially winning president. But when he won, he was a very exciting candidate even before, and a president too. He stood against Conklin's spoil system. This is pretty important because that's why people think that it might have been a conspiracy that because he stood against the Conklin stalwart spoil system and the Republican system, that they felt that a lot of people hated Garfield. Not a lot, I mean, a lot of the criminals hated Garfield because he stood against the criminal system that was going on. And so they thought possibly someone put Guiteau up to killing him, but we don't know for sure. So after he died, of course, the vice president becomes president, and we have President Chester A. Arthur is the 21st president. They called him Chet Arthur. Chester Arthur lived 1829 to 1886, and he was a stalwart. So he wasn't, his policies were not as progressive as Garfield's, you know, but everyone thought, you know, in fact, even Guiteau said that he wanted Arthur as president because he was a stalwart and not a progressive. Well, Chester Arthur did turn up against a lot of the criminal, I should say not criminal, a lot of the spoil system. I shouldn't say criminal spoil system, but their spoil system is that they were just bringing in whoever they wanted as political candidates, even though they had no merit in them. And so he stood against that, which was one of the grand things that Chester Arthur did as the 21st president. He never really ran for president. He only became president because he was vice president. So he felt the opposite in wanting to basically to lower tariffs. They thought he would raise his tariffs, but he really wanted to lower tariffs, which were, when tariffs are raised, it would actually help business, but actually farmers now were wanting to lower the tariffs. He was very laissez-faire, basically kind of sitting back and not doing a lot of policy, letting business go as it would go. And also, he did improve our Navy during his presidency, and that was one of his big things. One of the other big acts that happened during the Arthur presidency was the Pendleton Act. What is the Pendleton Act? It was basically that government jobs must be on merit. So, and that's what Garfield was going to do too. So he stood up with this act to make sure that they clear out this spoil system that was going on in the government. He was also called like the peacock fashion because he would go out for shopping and he'd buy all these clothes. They said he had 80 pairs of pants, so he always liked to dress in the top fashions. That was Chet. He had lost his wife, so when he came into the presidency, he was a bachelor, and I think it was his sister served as the first lady. So, but during this time, he was laid back, he took a lot of naps, and he rested, and they always thought, oh, he's lazy. But later on, they found out that he suffered poor health. He never told anyone, but he had a kidney disease that no one knew about. And so that's why he was resting. He also when he came in to the White House, he redecorated the whole White House and put stained glass, you know, new curtains. Everything was up to date and beautiful. He wanted the White House and the Capitol to look like the capital of the United States, you know. So he didn't choose to run to president. He didn't want to run to president afterwards. But little at that time was known. They always thought, why isn't he running for president, you know? But he died 2 years later at the age of 57 of kidney disease. So probably one of the reasons he didn't run is because he was so sick. He was a native of Vermont and grew up in New York. When you consider Chet Arthur, you think he was a New Yorker. He talked like a New Yorker and he acted like a New Yorker. So very different from Garfield. Garfield was from Ohio, and he was from New York. He worked in the customs collection of New York, in fact, and he was a school teacher and a principal, and he studied law before. And like I said before, Nell, his wife, died 2 years before the presidency of pneumonia. So he was grieving in the midst of his presidency. So really, he's not known too much for his president, except for a few major things. And one was that Pendleton Act, where basically saying government jobs must be on merit. They just can't come in and just put anyone in these positions. They would have tests they'd have to pass, that they'd have to come in and be able to fulfill the job by their merit. So, Chet Arthur. So on to Grover Cleveland. So Grover Cleveland, he became the next president in 1885 to 1889. He was the 22nd president. First, during the time of Grover Cleveland, we have a couple really important acts that came through Congress. One was the Interstate Commerce Act in 1887, and this was the expansion of the government control over international trade. So now the government's coming in and basically needing to control some of what was going on with international trade. Also, the deregulation of big businesses. And Congress passed an act that forbade railroads to grant rebates. Remember, we talked about the railroads in the last video, and that they were actually charging, rebates and charging some people more money than other people, and they were looking at them as being corrupted. So he also outlawed pooling arrangements. Pooling arrangements were when companies got together and decided to fix their rates and cooperate so they could limit competition and take out the smaller businesses, right? We went over that already. The Interstate Commerce Commission was formed, and it was a 5-member board appointed by the President and Senate and was confirmed during Grover Cleveland. This was the nation's first regulatory agency to supervise business, especially railroads, right? It was an important precedent in establishing the ICC. Just think, ICC, interstate commerce, between states, right? Between states, how commerce reacted between states. Interstate Commerce Act and Interstate Commerce Commission during Grover Cleveland. So, Interstate Commerce Commission in 1887. Large trusts under public condemnation. So large trusts, they got together, these businesses, and formed huge monopolies. And so it was very impossible for small businesses then. And the corporations defended themselves, citing themselves as the 14th Amendment. So basically saying, we are a trust, a bunch of businesses together into one monopoly of a business, but we're considered as an individual and the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment says that no state may deprive any person of life, liberty, or property. But they said that they, as a large trust, were really a person, right? And so they should be treated as a person. So that went to the Supreme Court in 1886, and the Supreme Court set the precedent that a corporation is a legal entity and should be treated as a person. So that was a plus for them. Now they could be treated and basically not under condemnation or control. Like you can't control a person, you couldn't control the monopoly. So that was the first precedent. Here, like this is robber baron or philanthropist. So we have Rockefeller and Carnegie setting forth these big monopolies. During Grover Cleveland, I'm going to talk more about Grover Cleveland's personality and life in just a little bit. And he was a Democrat. So far, all of the presidents I've talked since Abraham Lincoln have been Republicans, right? And so Grover Cleveland comes in as a Democrat. There's certain things that he does that are different from the Republican Party. You'll see, especially dealing with businesses and such. But basically, one thing about Grover Cleveland is that he had this police officer mentality, basically saying, you know, I'm here to be the top chief, but I'm going to act like policing things through, not really making so many new policies. In fact, he was known to veto. Veto means to disagree with most of the policies of Congress. And he vetoed more bills than any other president, and all the presidents combined up to that time. So, but also during this time, let's get into the Haymaker Square riot. So, there were many strikes against big business during the Grover Cleveland administration because a lot of employers had been taking advantage of employees, and they would strike, and then there'd be violence. So in 1886, the McCormick Reaper Works, we're talking about McCormick, remember farming equipment, Reaper Works, forced to give workers, they said you need to give workers an 8-day hour. That means they only need to work 8 days, not 12-hour days or, 15-hour days, but 8 hours a day. So they basically, instead of going in and just trying to compromise in some way with the employer, they decided to strike. And then, of course, the radicals came out, many of them communist radicals, and, basically caused the strike to go into a huge violent uproar. They instigated it into something bigger than it should have been. So the labor radicals at the Haymarket Square in Chicago, talking about Chicago, turned violent, and the police officers were attacked, and 7 police officers died, and 1 civilian, and many were injured. And so now people in the United States were looking at these labor strikes and thinking, oh, what's going to happen next? Could they just work this out with this 8-hour day and get overtime or something? But instead, they were instigated by, actually certain terrorists, we've come to find out, that wanted violence to come through this whole thing as a tactic to gain control. So many strikes during this time turned violent and had many instigators. But the Haymarket Square riot, just remember that was in Chicago, and it was the McCormick Company that they were striking against. Tariff question. Well, tariffs have always been a question since way back. We're talking about George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. Tariffs are tariffs meaning those taxes that were coming in to taxed as foreign countries would send in supplies. They were taxed. And so when they had high tariffs, there were less supplies coming in. And so American-made goods would actually be protected so that a country like China couldn't come in and sell a whole bunch of low-priced items and take over the smaller businesses that were in America. So the tariff question always lingered there. Should we have high tariffs, or should we have low tariffs, or should we have no tariffs, right? And that's what they were at the customs house when they were bringing in supplies and bringing in merchandise from other countries. They would have to pay taxes on it. So during the Civil War, tariffs were raised for the cost of war. So they raised the tariffs. But after the war, they started reconsidering and said we should probably lower the tariffs. So to keep the tariffs high would protect the American industry against foreign competition. And most farmers and laborers, they agreed they should keep the tariffs high, especially at that time. So the tariff issue was not an issue until 1887. And Congress, during President Grover Cleveland, requested that they wanted a lower tariff. And Cleveland, being on the more democratic side, thought, yes, we probably should lower the tariff. So, as we say here, high tariff rates encouraged new industries and helped the U.S. be a sufficient nation, encouraged high wages for factory workers in America So basically high tariffs were good for a lot of different reasons, you know, especially with industry. So industry would want high tariffs. They wouldn't want the tariffs to be lowered. Here's a picture of the custom house where they gathered those tariffs. So tariff reform was one of the issues that Grover Cleveland would stand by. And even in his presidency, run for tariff reform because he wanted to lower the tariffs. So the federal government's yearly income exceeded its expenditures at the time, he said. And so they decided then to use the surpluses. They would gather in these high tariffs, so the government was gathering in all this money, and they would use it now for local infrastructure and to rebuild the coastal defenses and rebuild the Navy, or to put the coastal defenses with modern Navy and Civil War pensions. Also, pensions were given to Civil War veterans, and so they wanted to support these pensions, which they did, but you'll find out that President Cleveland vetoed a lot of these pensions. And they also wanted to pay off the national debt in the midst of this. So tariffs were good in doing this. So, but of course, the tariff question would go up and down. Should we have tariffs? Each president would vary on these subjects. In 1888 election, the Republican Party was in favor of tariff protection, but the Democrats wanted tariff lowered. And so we'll find that that was a major issue here. So I'm actually gonna stop here because I want to go into Grover Cleveland's life a little bit here, and then we'll go into the next presidents, Harrison, Grover Cleveland again. He becomes president twice, and then we'll go into President McKinley, and then of course President McKinley's assassination. So let's stop there until our next video.